I think I told you early October, Bella and I got to go down to Nashville and watch one of our favorite programs on TV called SmackDown. Okay, you don't know what that is. It's wrestling. You know, where I'm from, it's wrestling. So, we were watching this wrestling. We love to watch it on TV. It's just kind of our thing. So we got to go down to Nashville, and we actually got to meet Cody Rhodes, which Bella says is her husband. So she just loves the guy, so we're able to meet him. I think I told you that he grabbed her phone and took some selfies with it. It's just a great experience. But before everything went down, we're getting our seats, and we're standing there. And it's one of these moments where you can just feel, oh, it's surreal. Like, we had been planning this for a couple of months, and Bella didn't know much about it until just a few weeks out. So you're looking forward to it, you're longing, you're anticipating, you can't wait for that day to come. And we get in that moment, and then we're just sitting there. And this picture, it's right before the show starts. People are getting their seats, and it's about to go live and all that. But I look over, and I can just see in Bella's eyes, and I've known her a little longer than you all have, and I can just see that there's a lot going on in there. And then when Cody comes out, like, all of a sudden it just gets that, it's one of those moments where it's quiet and it's just chill. And at any moment something's about to happen. And then it does. And the crowd is just juiced, and it's like we're one. We're just one body in this moment waiting. And then all of a sudden smoke. And then smoke comes out of this little tunnel and just fills the aisle and starts to go this way. And then these lights start going crazy and blaring all over the place. Then this music kicks in, and then the crowd erupts, and there's just so much going on. And Bella and I, we watched the video of this happening pretty frequently. And every time we watch the video, it's just not the same. It's exciting, but it's not the same, because when you're in that moment and you experience it, it's fantastic. But there's so much going on that there's only one or two things that you really latch onto or keep with you, or they become the highlight of that moment, because there's so much going on. So when you come to Matthew chapter 2, it's a story that's easy to overlook. It's a story of what we'd call the wise men or the Magi or King Herod. But when you read through this story, there's a lot going on, but it's one of those stories that when you read it, it's easy to move beyond. And then you read it and you forget really what's happening. Or there's some highlights of the story that maybe you hold on to that you've heard or whatever. But in the story, in the context, there's a lot going on, not only in that story. It's one of those opportunities for you and I to step in and say, oh, wow, there's a lot going on with this. And it means there's a lot going on with me as well. So when you jump in, Matthew chapter 2, verse 1 tells us that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but that's not the important thing for us this morning. He was actually born in Bethlehem in the time of King Herod. Now, what's super cool about this is that when you see this transition happening with the Magi and their search for something, we'll get to that in just a moment, their search for something, there's this star. There's something going on in the sky that they're pursuing, and it's hopefully going to lead them to what they're searching for. So they see this thing going on in the sky. And what's really interesting is that when you look at history and you look at some records that we have, there was probably some stuff happening. Now, some people say around 4 BC that there was this lunar eclipse. Also, some records show us that there was some kind of celestial phenomenon going on. Some suggest it was a comet. Some say it was a nova or a supernova. And then we also know from records that there was a census occurring, just like we looked at last week. Now, why is that important? Well, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, 4 BC, that's when all this stuff was happening. That's also when King Herod, that's when he died. So Jesus was born in the time of King Herod. So it's interesting, if you do a Google search, hey, when was Jesus born? You're probably going to find a lot of articles that say he was born sometime between 4 and 6 BC. And the question is, well, how in the world can he be born before himself, right? Like, how does that even happen? Well, BC is like before Christ, but AD, some people think it means after death, but that's not true. It's actually a Latin inscription that means Anno Domini, which is in the year of our Lord. So around 600 years after Jesus, we had a guy who was prompted by the Pope at the time to say, hey, why don't you redo the calendar? and start from day one. And day one would be the birth of Jesus. So a lot going on with that. So he starts retracing history. And the goal was to say, we're going to start with the birth of Jesus, but we're going to attach it to the birth of Rome. Well, Rome happened about 753 years before Jesus. And this guy, Dionysius, he actually missed 4 years. He traced everything back 749 years, which puts that 4-year gap, he puts it at 4 BC. That's why when you do a Google search or in some of your study Bibles, you'll see that Jesus wasn't born at 0. He was born at 4 BC, and that's the calendar that we use now. Well, a lot going on with this. Well, in that context, with all of this stuff occurring, Magi come from the east. And it's easy to see that word and think magic or magician. And while there may be some nuggets of truth in that, that wasn't all of their characteristics or description. And what we don't know about these guys is we don't know how many showed up. Neither do we know their names. Now fast forward through church history, and the church started ascribing a number, and the church started ascribing names to these wise men or these magi, but we just don't know their names. And we don't know their number. All we know is what Matthew tells us in Matthew chapter 2. So they come from the east, and they're looking for this star, something going on in the sky that we know was really occurring. So maybe it was some kind of phenomenon that actually led them. Maybe it was some kind of astronomy deduction that led them. Or maybe God was involved with a whole dynamic leading them as well. But they're coming looking for this star. Now, a lot's about to happen. So now we're introduced to Herod. Well, Herod hears about this, and he's disturbed, as with all of Jerusalem. And we're not really sure what all of Jerusalem means, but what we do know is that Herod hears about this, and he's disturbed. Now, the difference between hearing and listening is vast, and it's really important. Hearing is passive. It just happens. There's sounds, and you can't avoid them. Listening is leaning in to what you're hearing. Hearing is just the audible accumulation of these sound waves. But listening is trying to interpret what these sound waves are telling us. I mean, you can hear your car honking out in your driveway, or you hear it out in the neighborhood, or you hear it out in the cul-de-sac, and you're like, I hear that, but is it mine? If you just hear it, you hear it, but then you go and you peek out the door, you peek out the window to see if your alarm is going off. You're searching for some kind of meaning. That's the vast difference. So you could say that hearing is passive, but listening is active. So Herod hears about this. He just hears what's happening, but he doesn't search for the meaning like the Magi, which is probably why later on James would probably have a story similar to this in mind and write these words. Everyone should be quick, not to hear, but everyone should be quick to listen. There's a search because there's a lot going on. And if you're not careful, you're going to miss the most important parts. So Herod hears this, and he's disturbed. Now, I have to tell you, I don't know if you're following or checking with this or not, but when it says Herod is disturbed, I get this. And unfortunately, this is the part of the story where David Green can step into the story and really connect. So the idea of disturbed, the word literally means to set in motion what should stay still. To set in motion what should stay still. That's why some people say that this idea of disturbed is exceeding paranoia. Like you hear something or you're aware of something going on and it messes with you in a way that sets some stuff in motion that should be staying still. So you respond to that. You're not even responding to the reality because you're not investigating. You're not pursuing the truth. You're just aware something's happening, and then in your own heart and mind, you're just off to the races. Set in motion what should stay still. So a couple of days ago, I'm going into Chipotle. I'm at one of those times where I'm like, okay, it's bittersweet. I'm going into Chipotle after the lunch rush, before the dinner rush. So I know I'm going to get in quick, but I also know the food's not going to be that good. You know what I'm talking about? You go into that. So I go in and I'm thinking, okay, the rice is going to be sticky. They're not going to have any of the fajita veggies. The chicken is they're going to scoop it in, and I'm going to hear a ding, ding, ding with that metal spatula hitting the pot and everything. So I go in, and as I'm getting there, this bus of I guess it's a volleyball team of gals shows up. And I'm like, oh my gosh, is it awkward to run to the door and try to beat them? Do you do that or not? Should I do that? So I speed up the walking a little bit, and they're parked in two different spots, one over here, one over here. So they're coming at both angles. So when I get to the door, they're actually holding the door open for me. And as a guy, I'm kind of a traditionalist in a lot of ways. That was hard for me. I wanted to hold the door open for them, but I'm also I do want to get my Chipotle. So I go in, but there's half of them in already and half behind me. So it's this awkward setup where I'm just in the middle of them. And then I hear someone just filled with so much wisdom and compassion and mercy and awareness say, hey, let him go ahead of us. And I'm like, yes, whoever said that. So I turn around, I'm like, thank you. And I look, and the lady who's on the other side of the counter, she hears this as well. So we lock eyes, and I'm thinking, we're on the same page. So I get up there and I order the bowl, I go through the line, order the burrito, go through the line and all that. Stand at the register, I'm thinking, I'm done in about 30 more seconds. I'm going to boom the card, then we're good to go. So she folds the burrito up, and if you've been to Chipotle, they slide it down. So it slides down about halfway, and she starts making bowls. Slides one down. I'm thinking, that's no big deal. I got a few more minutes, it's all good. She makes another bowl, slides it down. What's happening here? She makes another bowl, so I'm not kidding you, slides it down. And now my burrito is being hit, and it's bumped and it's getting dinged. And it's with every one, that first bowl is sticking into my burrito and it's attached there. So she makes about 6 bowls. And I start looking at her. I don't know if you've been in a situation like that or not. I'm looking trying to convey my thoughts. Hey, remember, I'm not with them. I'm first. So we're standing there and I'm looking at her, and it's one of those things where I think she's avoiding looking back at me. So I'm looking more intently, trying to get her energy waves to feel mine and look at me and all that stuff. And it doesn't work. Well, about 2 more bowls come, and then a guy bolts from the back. He washes his hands and he runs up to the cash register and he checks me out, and I realize, oh, that's not even her job. Some things in me were set in motion that should have stayed still. I shouldn't tell you this one, but maybe you've been there. I was driving on Pink Pigeon in Lexington not too long ago, and I'm driving, there's this car in front of me that's just not going the speed limit, okay? It's below the speed limit. We're driving, and then I notice there's a little weaving from the lanes, and this person's annoying me. So we get up, and they happen to be going to the same way I am, so they're going to turn left. I'm going to turn left. Get behind them. They stop at the light. I ease up, stop. And I realize there's one of these pictures on the back window, and you can tell that it's a picture of Jesus with the crown of thorns on his head. And just for a moment, like a whiff of judgment. You ever had just a whiff of judgment that just comes from you? And a whiff of judgment, I'm like, oh yeah, driving like that, you follow Jesus? You ever been in a situation like that? I mean, it's so stupid, right? But that's what this idea of being disturbed represents. It sets in motion something that should be still. When you think of Herod and you look at his track record, we probably know that later on in Matthew, he's responsible for the murders of a lot of infant children. But he also killed his father's favorite wife, which tells you a little bit about their story. He killed his father's favorite wife. And then he kills her sons. And then he kills her. He also killed 3 of his sons and 300 of his military leaders. This guy was disturbed. A lot going on in his life. And when I read this story, I also get the impression that there's just a little warning or a little caution for you and for me. Because God is doing some fantastic work. He's doing some fantastic work with this phenomenon that's leading these magi to the infant Christ. So God is involved in this. But this guy simply hears about it. And he's disturbed, so he starts working against that. And it's a reminder for me, a big caution light for David Green. Pump the brakes on the judgment, David. Because sometimes when you're in those moments of judging and you're just hearing and some stuff is set in motion that should be still, sometimes your offense is so much more about you than it is about him. God's actually doing work that I couldn't see. God's doing work that Herod couldn't see. That's a great caution for us. So the story goes on, and you read that these wise men, they go in pursuit of this infant, so they start following this star. And then we read something in verse 10 that's just a really interesting word. They actually arrive, and they see that all this stuff that they've been tracking, this direction that they've been traveling, it seems like it's actually playing out in maybe the ways they had anticipated, expected, or hoped for. So the text tells us that when they saw this stuff happening, they were overjoyed. Not just filled with joy, they were overjoyed. And there's a lot going on in that word. Just like the word disturbed means exceeding paranoia. Well, the word overjoyed, when we translate it, it actually means exceeding joy. So you think, whatever road you travel to get to joy, and you're experiencing joy, well, there's a realm past joy. And that's overjoyed. So I don't know, do you get that, or do we need a little help? Like, think of it like this. Elf. I mean, look at the guy's eyes, right? And what's the phrase you hear when you think this? Yeah, right. I know him. And he's right there. So there's this overjoyed. There's a lot going on in this individual's life right here. There's a lot going on in Buddy's world because he's overjoyed. Or what about the next one? What's happening in this scene? Yeah. He was just able to give his shot with Santa, right? He had his opportunity. He gave his spiel. He had written the paper. He had gotten, a C+ on it. Wasn't satisfactory. It deflated him. He wanted to talk to the big guy, and he knows that this is just kind of a representative, but he's able to give his pitch to Santa, and he's like thrilled that he got it all out because there's a lot going on there. And then this is one of my mom's favorite movies, It's a Wonderful Life. You remember this scene? George kind of gets his life back, and anytime I see this, my first thought is, and some of you may get this, my mouth's bleeding, Bert. My mouth's bleeding, because this realization that he's back into his life, there's so much going on that he's just overjoyed. He's thrilled, and it's exceeding. It's moving past joy. Or what about the Grinch? Any Grinch fans? You know, what's happening in this moment? There's a lot going on with him, and it's exceeding joy. Or what about our buddy Clark? I mean, when he finally, boom, then the little explosion and the lights lit up. It's a beaut, Clark. It's a beaut. And you can just see in Clark's eyes that this is finally happening. All that he worked for, there's something going on. And all of those people, you can just see it in their eyes. There was something they wanted. Some kind of search, some kind of pursuit. They were after something. And then it happens. And they're not just happy about it. They're overjoyed. I mean, there's a lot going on when someone is overjoyed. There's actually a lot going on in the Greek text too. We talk a little bit about Greek and Hebrew because the Old Testament we translate from Hebrew and the New Testament we translate from Greek. And when you actually look at the Greek text, the word overjoyed is not there. It's this sentence. They rejoiced with joy, great, exceedingly. That is literally what Matthew penned. But for our 21st century American minds, it's better to have, they were overjoyed. So there was exceedingly great joy, and that's what they rejoiced with. Like, there's so much going on that it's even hard to describe it because of what's happening. Overjoyed. That's awesome. So what happens after you're overjoyed? I mean, where do you move on from that? Or like, what's the point of it? Is that the culmination? Is that the end point? Is that the direction? So the Magi are able to experience this moment, and boom, it's over now. Well, the text tells us that they're actually able to bow down and worship this infant. And I don't know about you, but that seems like a balance of odd and extremely profound to me, that they would bow down in pursuit of worshiping this infant. Another thing we know about the Magi is that they weren't royalty, but they were religious and political advisors. So when they were in pursuit of looking at this star, hoping to find a new king, well, that's what they labeled Jesus as. They labeled him as the newborn king. And in doing so, they offer worship to him because they're overjoyed because of everything that had occurred. In other words, so much more had happened that they could even anticipate or expect. This was so much more meaningful and deep for them. And it doesn't leave us, the story just doesn't leave us there. Like when you and I, there's a lot going on in a really, really good way. There's a couple of things, a couple of outcomes that should be a part of our lives, and that's what happens with the Magi. So you read in this story near the end, so they worshiped him, and then they opened their treasures, and they presented him with gifts of gold and incense or frankincense and myrrh. I love that little line, and that's one of those lines that's so easy for you and I to just read and then miss as one of the highlights of the story. They actually brought things to this guy. They gave gifts to this baby. And when I read that, it's not lost on me that that's a reflection of Madison Hills. I mean, I think about you and how so many of you just stepped up and served the Hall family yesterday and then about 3 weeks ago. You were just there to provide something that wasn't going to be provided. And it was a meal, but it was an opportunity also to set at ease some relationships, to set at ease some strain, to allow people to come together. Like Madison Hills just has this way of giving and extending that just comes so naturally. This morning when we were cooking, it was previously marketed as the staff breakfast. But then as December unfolded, the staff got pulled in a couple of different directions, and we were thinking about how we were going to pull this off, and some people stepped in and then just rippled, and there were people coming in and out of the kitchen all morning. Hey, how can I help? What can I do? And that's the outcome. When you offer your life to the Christ, when you surrender and you bow down and your identity is about worshiping him, it reframes all that's going on so that you start giving, and you give to him and to his cause and to his ways. And that's Madison Hills. Also some of you have asked me about end of year giving. And when I've had some of those conversations with a few of you, it's not just, hey, I want to get the gift in by the end of the year. You said, I want to make sure that Madison Hills is set for 2025. And I want to make sure that we're in good financial standing. Sometimes giving can be up and down, and that can be tricky, especially for a church. So I just want you to know that if that's on your heart, to do some end-of-year giving, you can see me, you can see Sean, and talk to us about that. Also, Sean and I were talking. There were a couple of conversations going on, and I just think this shows the heart of Madison Hills Christian Church. Some conversations going on about estate planning, and people looking and saying, you know what, when my time here is done, I want to make sure that I leave a mark at Madison Hills. This place has been so valuable to me that I want to make sure that once I'm gone, I leave a lasting contribution. And that thrills me. Not all of us are able to do something like that, but it doesn't negate the fact that we're all stepping in and offering what we have. Several years ago, when the doctors decided that I was actually going to live, Michelle and I were assessing where we were going to go, the direction we were going to go in our family, whether we were going to stay here. We had a couple of connections up north, one in Florida, and we were thinking about where we were going to relocate from home, move away from Kentucky, or what we were going to do. And I picked up just a small job working third shift. I worked at a little boutique hotel as a night auditor just to get back into the workforce, if you will. Try to get some stability with my physical body and all of that. So some time goes on, and I'm starting to feel the strain of that. The third shift wasn't working for me. I would come home. The children were just getting up. They were a lot smaller. They were just getting up, and I was exhausted and needing to go to sleep. I hated that. The job was great, but it wasn't enough to really cover our family's expenses. So we were starting to feel the strain of that because my sickness and time in the hospital had depleted most of our resources. So we were feeling the strain of that. And there were other external factors that were just compounding that context. Well, one night, third shift, I'm behind the desk. It's quiet. All the people in the rooms are asleep, and it's just me. And I remember bending over, and we had to wear suits at this boutique hotel. I remember bending over, and I had my jacket off, and I bent over to pick something off of this bottom file cabinet. And when I made this motion, my shirt ripped. And for you, it's probably no big deal, but in that moment, with all of the pressure mounting, that just sent me over the edge. And I just dropped to my knees and I was in tears. And I said, God, I just can't do this anymore. Well, during the time, Michelle and I had made a commitment that we were going to keep our family intact spiritually. No matter the pressures, whether they were financial or physical, we were going to stay in spiritual, really good shape. So we were going to a local church. Well, about 6 hours later, as I got off on a Sunday morning, we went to this class that we were attending, one of the Sunday morning groups. After the class, one of the leaders comes up to me. She and her husband led the class. Comes up and says, hey, something's been on my heart, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to go home to your wife, and I want you all to come up with a number. And then I want you to call me in a few days and tell me this number. And we're going to give that number to you because you need to be back in ministry and you don't need to be in the hotel any longer. 6 hours after that. So it was a really odd moment for me. And there was a lot going on. So I go back to Michelle and we come up with a number, and I actually call this lady back and I'm like, hey, this is really difficult for me, but we actually have a number. And she was like, great. So we make arrangements, and the four of us, she and her husband, Michelle and I, we go out to dinner at a restaurant, and we have the meal. Then it comes to kind of that moment when the meal's over and just a little small talk going on. And they're like, so do you have a number? And we're like, well, yeah, I mean, we do. This is really kind of awkward for us. They're like, well, write it on this napkin. So they slide a napkin over to us. And we write the number on the napkin. It's like one of the scenes in a movie that we're living. We slide it back over at this negotiation. And the guy picks up the napkin and he looks at the number and he shows it to her. And then they kind of lean into each other. And he gets his phone out and they look at some stuff, crunch some numbers. And then I'll never forget, he looks at her and he was like, you know, you just want to do this instead? And we don't know what to think. And you just want to do this instead? And then they write a number down and slide it back to us. And it was $5,000 more than the number that we had actually put on there. So they designed a position at this church, and for me to work back into full-time ministry and to heal up and all that stuff. And they did so just from their own hearts. They told us later on that some time ago that they wanted to get into full-time ministry and kind of serve a church in the role that I serve. But some time into that, they realized that wasn't their calling. Instead, they were really good with money. And they felt that God wanted them to make as much money as possible and then resource the kingdom. I've had conversations with some of you. And that's exactly where you are. And when I think of that story, I think of you. Because some of you realize that the kingdom needs resourced. And it needs resourced with the gifts that you can give. And I just think that's amazing that some conversations are going on about year-end giving. And not only year-end, but into 2025. You want to make sure that you're using the stewardship that God has given you. You're stewarding your resources well to make a lasting impact here and for the kingdom. I applaud you, Madison Hills. So naturally, you step in and you serve, whether it's this morning, yesterday, 3 weeks ago, or the end of the year, or this coming year. You bow down You worship the Christ. And since you worship him, you give to him and his ways. But the story goes on. So they presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, get this, they returned to their country. But there's no period. There's a few more words. They returned to their country by another route. Some of your Bibles would say, by another way. In other words, they're going back home, but not the same way. One of the things I love about Madison Hills is that when people come here, we leave here and you go back to your life. You go back to your jobs, you go back to your house, you go back to your communities. But so many times I have conversations with you after service and I realize you're going back, but not the same way. There's a change. There's a difference. You understand there's a different route, even though you're going back to the same context. It's not the same way. So when you look at this story, there's a lot going on. And it's a reminder that you and I, we have worth. You have worth. You're valuable. You're important. You're important to the God that we worship and the God that loves us and the God that we give our best shot at loving. In other words, you were created not to worship someone or something that is subpar to the one true holy God. You were created to worship him. And you were created not to give your energy and your attention to initiatives and causes that cause his ways to fade out in your life. And you were created not to stay the same, especially when staying the same is filled with shame and heartache. You were created to pursue him, to search for him, to listen, and then when you find him, to worship him and be used by him. That's Christmas.